Michael Rapaski. I'll be taking us through some of the CompuCram this evening, as I do every week, and also answering any oddball questions that any of you have to ensure that we're in a position to get you through that pesky little thing called the Ohio Department of Real Estate Salesperson exam, and make sure that you get busy building your real estate career. So as always, if there are sections that you would like to cover this evening, I would be more than happy to cover those. You can drop those in the chat box. Thank you to the folks who always reach out and provide a little insight on what you would like to cover. We heard from a few folks over the weekend, some folks that are getting pretty close to studying for the exam about some sections that they would be interested in covering. So I'm going to start with those this evening. Those two are valuation and market analysis, and also transfer of title. These are sections that we don't often cover. They are on the smaller side of the number of questions that you'll see in the exam, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't cover them. So just want to make sure that everybody is getting covered what they need. So as we get started with market analysis, go ahead and I'll give 60 seconds to just drop into the chat box anything that anybody wants to cover this evening. So we'll get through those first two, and then we'll have time for probably one or two more. And then at the end, I would love the opportunity, as I do each week, to see or to tell you a little bit about how to prepare for the exam. As I know, got a couple people that'll be taking it before our next time around. See you there, Kyle. I believe you're scheduled for this Saturday, so let's get you what you need to get that one put behind you. All right, we're going to go ahead, excuse me, and dive in with valuation and market analysis. We got 10 questions here. All right. Question number one, staff appraisers might be used by a large mortgage company reviewing hundreds of appraisals a year, B, a homeowner who wants an estimate of value, C, both a large corporation with many properties to manage or a large mortgage company with hundreds of appraisals each year, or D, large corporation with many properties to manage. Just drop into the chat A, B, C, or D. All right, looks like the crowd says C, and that is correct. Those are used by both types of company, either large corporations that hold a lot of properties or mortgage companies that are racking through hundreds of appraisals a year. All right, an appraisal is A, the cost less depreciation for age and condition, B, utility, C, supported opinion of value, or D, value divided by gross income. All right, lots of C's in the chat, and that is going to be correct. And it's important to remember, you may see this on the exam, but an appraisal is the supported opinion of value on the day of the appraisal, right? So if you have an appraisal from a year ago or 18 months ago or 18 days ago, that may or may not be accepted by a mortgage company because the appraisal is said to be on the day, the value that day. Right, features that enhance desirability of real estate are often called A, appurtenance, B, amenities, C, appraisal, or D, assessments. All right, you guys nailed that one. B, it is amenities, marble fireplaces, better locations, floor plan for condos, things of that nature. All amenities that will drive value up. The income cap technique uses A, annual net income, B, annual gross income, C, net monthly income, or D, gross monthly income. The income cap or income capitalization. All right, a lot of B's in there, and it's actually going to be annual net income. So gross is everything that comes in. The net is how much money you'll make after you pay for all of your expenses. All right. So if I make $100,000 a year, but I spend $90,000 to make it, my net income is going to be $10,000. And that's what I'm going to factor the capitalization rate on. And this will cause properties to vary greatly if they are in locations with high taxes. If they're in locations, with high cost of utilities, water and sewer are really big ones there, or that are expensive to insure, right? So whenever you're thinking about cap or income cap or capitalization, you want to be thinking in annual net. Annual net. All right, large manufacturing building there is a large manufacturing building in Flint. This will be a definite economic boost to the city. How will it affect home prices? A, no way to determine this. B, they'll fall. C, it doesn't make a difference. Or D, home prices will rise. So based on supply and demand, if you move a big factory into an area, right, you add a large manufacturing building, there are going to be either more people coming to the area, which is going to increase the demand on homes, or there is going to be more people working, which means more income, and maybe they can pay more rent. A couple different ways, but there's a rise in demand for both for housing. And that means that homes could go for a higher price. An insurance company might use an appraisal to determine A, none of these, B, market value, C, the ethnic composition of a neighborhood, or D, the replacement cost, determining the amount of coverage required. All right, since we know it's an insurance company, they're going to be concerned with replacement costs, which is how much does it cost if this house burns down or gets knocked over by a tornado? How much does it cost to go ahead and replace that property? That's going to be an insurance company's concern. The term eminent in reference to real property valuation refers to the A, features, both tangible and intangible, that enhance desirability of real estate. B, valuation placed on real property that is the basis for the amount of tax levied. C, the value of properties established for the purposes of computing taxes. Or D, an increase in the value of a property either due to a positive improvement on the area or elimination of negative factors. And you guys were all over this one. It's going to be A. It's those features, both tangible and intangible, that increase the desirability of a property, like, as we mentioned, marble fireplaces, better locations, better floor plans, better, anything that's, not the physical structure of the building. A defensible opinion or estimate of value of real property as of a certain date is known as A, the market price, B, the marketable title, C, appreciation, or D, appraisal. All right, the appraisal is correct. That's just the same question we had previously, said a different way. Market price refers to the price buyers actually pay the seller. Marketable title refers to the ease with which ownership of the property can be transferred. And appreciation is when you have a property that becomes more valuable. What approach to appraisal is best for new construction? A, comparison, B, income, C, cost, or D, estimate? So I think I'm seeing mostly C's in there, and that's correct. This is calculated based on the cost of materials to build the building, because as it is new that very day, the number of comparables will be low. Nothing in here suggests that this new construction is for income-related properties. So that's neither of those are going to be the right answer. It would be unethical for an appraiser to A, refuse to make a commercial appraisal because she only has residential experience. B, ask for payment in advance. C, base her payment on a percentage of the appraised value. Or D, appraise a property in which she has a disclosed interest. All right, seeing D's and B's. So get your answer in here. And I think I'm seeing slightly more D's. And that is unfortunately incorrect. So the key word here is disclosed. Because the interest is disclosed, it's not unethical. If it was an undisclosed interest, that would be unethical, right? Similar to not disclosing that you're a real estate agent when you're buying a personal property or selling a personal property. The idea that they would base their payment on the percentage of appraised value means that they're going to potentially appraise that property higher to increase their own pay, and that would be unethical. All right, so hopefully we didn't get all those right, but that's okay. We will, hopefully we picked up why we didn't get them right. I'm going to dive into transfer of title next. Let's see what we have here. 5 questions, transfer of title. A buyer decides to buy a house and all the furniture in it. The buyer and seller should execute A, deed and a bill of sale. B, a mortgage and a promissory note. C, a deed and a mortgage. Or D, a habendum clause. All right, A's and B's in the chat, more A's than B's, and that's correct. Deed transfers real property title. Bill of sale transfers the ownership of personal property. So the house is going to transfer with the deed. The bill of sale is going to allow for the transfer of all the furniture inside of the property. Perhaps the easiest way to remove a cloud on title is A, foreclosure, B, a quiet title action, C, eminent domain, or D, a quitclaim deed. All right, we're seeing a little bit of everything here. B, D, B, 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 D. So we think B is the right one, and it's actually D. Quit claims can be issued by reported owners or lien holders to release their interest in the property, right? So when they do that, it's like, hey, all the title history is just, I'm relinquishing my authority over it. Although quiet title and foreclosure do that, they're more difficult and time consuming. So, quiet title involves lawyers and are fairly expensive. Foreclosures and involve the bank and their acquisition of the title. And so eminent domain is going to be when the government takes private land for public use. So it doesn't really apply from a title standpoint here because title would still have to transfer. So the quitclaim deed is the easiest way to do it. All right, on a closing statement, a new mortgage loan is usually A, a credit to the buyer, B, a credit to the seller, C, a debit to the seller, or D, a debit to the buyer. All right, looks like A is our winner here, and that is correct. So The credit is going to reduce the amount of money the buyer has to bring to the closing table. So that's, and remember, it's a credit to the buyer, not a debit to the seller, because the buyer needs that money to pay the seller. And so you're in a position there where, you know, you want credited for the funds in the mortgage that you took on as a buyer, not, you know, just a reduction in price because the seller is not giving the mortgage. All right, a deed should be recorded in order to A, provide constructive notice to the world, B, provide actual notice to the buyer, C, provide lis pendens, or D, prove ownership. All right, looks like A's and D's are are showing up here. Looks like a few more D's than A's. Unfortunately, it was A. And so the deed does not have to be recorded to prove ownership, right? Actual notice in the public records is what happens with the recording of the deed. Putting the buyer on notice to search the title of the property before buying. Lis pendens just means there's a lien pending. Recording does not prove ownership, but rather the deed in the chain, but rather puts a deed in the chain of ownership. So it is not necessary to prove ownership, but to keep a clear chain of title. All right, an instrument in writing that transfers ownership of tangible property is called a listing, B, blanket mortgage, C, bill of sale, or D, mortgage. All right, this is a similar question as we had before. The tangible property, different than real property. Real property is transferred through deed. Tangible property transferred through a bill of sale. All right, gang, what else do we want to cover tonight? Those are our first two sections, smaller ones, but still important ones. Seems like maybe we got, you know, got a few of those wrong. So if you were part of the folks that didn't get those right, pop back in there, work those, you know, before we get back together next week or before you take your exam. So Ariel wants to do contracts. You know I love to do contracts. It's the single biggest section on your exam. If anyone's tired of hearing me say that, it's probably time for you to take the exam. And so just a little test humor for you. But it is important that this is one that you master because there are so many questions that are directly related to contracts or informed by contracts. All right, question number one, Mary buys Sally's property, which is subject to mortgage. After 5 years of payment, Mary defaults and misses a payment. Which is the appropriate remedy? A, the mortgagor has no recourse as there was no assumption. B, they should sue only Sally as Mary took the property subject to a mortgage and there was no assumption. They should sue only Mary as she assumed Sally's mortgage, or they should sue both Mary and Sally as they both are liable to the mortgage. All right, we're a little bit all over the board here. This is a tough one. It's not a well-worded question, and quite honestly, every time it pops up on one of these, I'm always like, wait a minute, which is it? What's going on here? So the deal here is Mary bought the property, right? Which is subject to a mortgage. There's nothing in here that says that that mortgage was assumed. Just says she bought the property. So Mary is not liable for that. So if there's a default by Mary, without assumption, it still sues mortgage. So I'm fairly certain that I was wrong. And the mortgagor, damn it, that's what it is. See, it got me, guys. It's a tough question. The mortgagor here is Sally. The mortgagee would be the bank. And see, I just blasted right past that one. And so Sally has no recourse here because there is no assumption. So the assumption transfers, it states that Mary bought the property, which is subject to a mortgage, doesn't state loan assumption. Sally remains totally liable for the loan and cannot sue Mary. The bank, which is the mortgagee, can sue only Sally since there was no assumption. So the trick in this trick question is that what's the remedy for the original mortgager? The mortgager originally is Sally, not the bank. The mortgagee in this scenario is the bank. I apologize for that. We'll edit that before we post this online. The law requiring certain real estate contracts to be in writing to be enforceable is called A, parole evidence rule, B, statute of limitations, C, the written instrument law, or D, the statute of frauds. Warren, you're communicating to me only directly. So if you want to share your answers with the whole chat, you're more than welcome to. And this one is going to be the statute of frauds. Statute of limitations limits the amount of time that somebody can be persecuted for a crime. Parole evidence prohibits oral testimony from creating terms in an otherwise written contract. There is no such thing as the written instrument law. So the statute of frauds requires things to be in writing. A bilateral contract is one that A, binds only one party to an agreement, B, is void, C, binds both parties to an agreement, or D, is unenforceable. All right, you guys are right. When you see bilateral, think two or both, right? You see unilateral, like a unicycle, think one. All right, a buyer made an earnest money deposit of $500 on a $40,000 house, but withdrew the offer before the seller accepted it. The broker should dispose of the buyer's earnest money by A, returning it to the buyer, B, keeping it as part of his commission, C, giving it to the seller, or D, paying it to the court. All right, you guys are all over that. Before the contract is accepted, it's the buyer's money, right? It never stopped being the buyer's money. Once the contract is accepted, that's where earnest money issues always come up because technically it's nobody's money, right? After the transaction closes, it's the seller's money again. Or it's the seller's money, but it's the middle that's weird. Since we didn't actually have a contract, that earnest money never stopped being the buyer's. All right, a broker deposits a buyer's $500 earnest money check into the broker's personal checking account. The broker is guilty of A, capitalization, B, cooperation, C, commingling, or D, condemnation. You guys were on that before I could even finish reading the question. Commingling the funds. Commingling the funds is when you take the funds and you put them in an account that they are not supposed to go into. So you're mingling or commingling the funds that are not supposed to be commingled. Now, this question could be worded a different way, where they say, "Hey, the broker put them in the broker's non-interest-bearing trust account and then use the funds to pay for utilities." That's conversion. So commingling is right funds, wrong account. Conversion is right account, wrong use. Got it? A lender qualifies a new buyer who signs a note and mortgage. Then the same terms of note and mortgage are transferred to a new mortgager, relieving the original mortgager of any liability. This is known as A, subrogation, B, novation, C, defeasance, or D, assignment. All right, seeing B's and D's, but more B's than D's, and novation is correct. The substitution of a new contract or mortgage in this standpoint with the withdrawing party relieved of liability is novation. Assignment is the transfer of one property's interest into an existing contract to someone else. The assigner is not relieved of liability. Subrogation is the substitution of one creditor for another. And defeasance clause declares the mortgage satisfied when the final payment is made. A listing agent shows a buyer a home. The buyer then fills out an offer to buy the home, which the listing agent takes and explains to the sellers. The sellers like the offer and sign their acceptance of it. Then they hand the accepted offer to their agent with the instructions to deliver the accepted contract back to the buyer. At this point, all the following statements are true, except A, the accepted offer does not need to be communicated or delivered to the buyer. B, the sellers have not relinquished their control of the acceptance. C, the offer was accepted by the sellers. Or D, the listing agent now has possession of the accepted offer. So which of those is not true? All right, guys, we're on it. To have a meeting of the minds, as they say, the acceptance needs to be communicated back. Which is not an essential element of a real estate contract? A, good consideration. B, valuable consideration. C, offer and acceptance. Or D, lawful and possible objective. All right, you guys were on top of that one. Good consideration is things like love and kindness. Valuable consideration is things like money and jewelry and things that hold value. So contracts you cannot go into contract because you love someone or because promising someone your love. Which would a buyer prefer? Land installment contract or purchase money mortgage? Which would the buyer prefer? A, a purchase money mortgage. B, as either convey legal title. C, either as they both convey equitable title. Or D, the land installment contract. Again, you guys are all over this because the purchase money mortgage is the one where the buyer receives the property on the day of closing in the form of a deed, right? Versus the deed does not transfer in a land installment contract until the final payment is made. When an offer is presented, the seller may A, accept the offer and it becomes a contract. B, any of these answers. C, make a counteroffer. Or D, reject the offer. All right. Any of these are the options of the seller when they receive a contract or an offer, rather. All right. A, the consideration for the sale of the, sorry, I got to read the question. Earnest money is best described as A, consideration for the sale of a property. B, commission paid to the broker. C, money deposited by the purchaser with the broker or seller to pay for the expense of examining the title. Or D, which you have all identified as the correct answer, good faith money deposited by the purchaser at the time of signing the offer. Good faith money is what it is. It's not there for any specific use other than to demonstrate that this person is a serious buyer. All right, question number 12. If a broker receives two offers for the same house at the same time, one from the agent of a cooperating brokerage and another from his own agent, the broker should A, reject both offers, B, submit both offers, C, submit the agent's offer to the seller first, his agents, or submit the cooperating broker's offer. And yes, it is B. When you are in possession of multiple offers, you should present them at the same time. An agreement of sale is a contract between A, the buyer and seller, B, the seller, buyer, and mortgagee, C, the seller and the broker, or D, the buyer and the broker. A's all across the board. Contracts are between buyers and sellers. Listing agreements are between sellers and brokers. Buyer representation agreements are between buyers and brokers. And mortgages are between the buyer and the bank. All right, a buyer makes an offer to buy a house for $50,000. The seller does not accept the offer, but responds he will accept no less than $55,000. The seller has just made a bilateral enforceable contract, B, a unilateral enforceable contract, C, an option, or D, a counter offer? All right, D's across the board. It is a counter offer, which is actually two things: the rejection of the initial offer and the submission of a new offer. So one thing to keep in mind, guys, and you'll see a question on this, I'm sure, is if the buyer were to reject the counter offer, the seller cannot go back and accept the original offer. When they reject it, it terminates that offer and it cannot then be accepted down the road. So when you're working with clients and they want to counter, make sure they know, like, if the buyer walks, we can't just go back. All right, the scope and purpose of a real estate contract does not include A, the home, B, real property, C, fixtures, or D, personal property. D is correct. A real estate contract does not include personal property. As we said, that needs to be on a separate bill of sale. The exception to that is when something is identified as a fixture, right? Like in a fixed cabinets or a large mirror or something to that effect, that your clients would want to stay. And you'll most commonly see this as trade fixtures. So just keep that in mind. All right, team, what section do we want to cover next? What are we thinking here, team? Tiana says, Will says contracts again. Tiana says principles of agency. Let's dip into principles of agency here. And if we have time, we'll circle back to contracts at the end. All right. Which of the following would terminate an agency relationship between a seller and a listing broker? A, bankruptcy of the seller. B, the seller's refusal to accept a full price offer. C, death of a salesperson who secured the listing. Or D, the broker's offer of cooperation extended to other broker members of the local multiple listing service. All right. Group feels pretty strongly that it is bankruptcy, and it is. Agency relationships get terminated when things like with foreclosure and declaration of bankruptcy, because it is a release in the authority to do the sale. Death of the salesperson does not terminate it because the listing agreement is between the seller and the broker. So that, even when you take a listing, you're taking a listing as a sub-agent of a broker who that listing will be with. It'll be your listing, but if anything were to happen to you, that agreement would stay with the broker and the brokerage. All right, the fiduciary duties of a COLD include A, accountability, B, obedience, C, all of these, or D, loyalty. It is all of these: accountability, obedience, care, loyalty, and disclosure of certain defects. All right. An agent is one who, A, is owed a fiduciary duty, B, represents the agent of another, C, is represented by another, or D, acts or has power to act for another. All right, seeing on D's, and that is right. Agent works for the principal or for another. Person who that agent works for is where the fiduciary duty is owed. All right, question number 4. 2 brokers get together at a breakfast meeting and then decide they will each agree to work certain geographic areas of town. What statute has been violated? A, the Sherman Antitrust Act. B, the federal housing antitrust law, C, the civil rights law, or D, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. They will try to trip you up with some phrases that sound very much like they should be what it is, but this is actually just a subclause of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which prevents monopolies. Price fixing and market fixing are two examples of monopolies. A relationship between one person and another, wherein the agent is given the right to act on behalf of the principal in a business setting, is usually called A, customer representation, B, an agency relationship, C, trespass, or D, involuntary servitude. All right, B, that is the definition of agency relationship. There is no such thing as customer representation, because if you are representing them, they are no longer your customer and they are now your client. All right, for a broker to act for more than one party in a real estate transaction without the knowledge and consent of all parties is A, grounds for disciplinary action, B, acceptable, C, ethical, or D, contrary to the Board of Realtor bylaws. All right, lots of A's, and that is correct. Most states allow brokers to act as dual agents as long as both parties have given consent. As long as both parties has given consent, and know that both parties do not require representation. Someone can represent themselves. I'm working a deal right now where an offer came in and the buyer said, I am unrepresented. So that will not be a scenario where I will be representing both. I will only represent my client. The other individual will represent and negotiate on their own behalf. The fiduciary duty of loyalty requires that the agent A, arrange financing for the buyer, B, obey each and every request of the principal, C, hold the principal's interest above all other interests, or D, look out for their own interest first. Now, if you get a question that's as straightforward as this one, just remember accountability, care, obedience, loyalty, and disclosure, right? So obey each and every request of the principal is obedience, but the loyalty to hold those principles highest above all others is what is going to be loyalty. One who acts or has the power to act for another is termed the A, client, B, agent, C, principal, or D, customer. It is B. You got that one right. All right, the person authorized to act in the place of someone else in legal matters is known as A, power of attorney, B, attorney in fact, C, attorney at law, or D, pro se. All right, B's flooding the chat box, and that is correct. It is the attorney in fact, because there's defined other matters. Person designated under power of attorney on behalf of another is called the attorney in fact. Attorney at law is a licensed person. Pro se just means for one's self. So when you have power of attorney, you are an attorney in fact. All right, if a buyer client of a broker wants to purchase a property listed by the broker, which of the following is true? As A, as long as the listing salesperson and salesperson representing the buyer are different, no disclosure is required since there's no conflict of interest. B, the buyer and seller must give informed consent in order for the broker to represent both of them in the transaction. C, the buyer agency must be terminated, or D, the broker must refer one of the parties to a different broker. All right, so you guys nailed that one, and that is that as long as everybody consents, it's okay. Know that, you know, sometimes people aren't comfortable with that, and that's fine, and they still want representation, so you would refer to one of the 450 other agents in our office and create a scenario where that person could have representation. Or they can represent themselves. Again, you do not have to, both parties are not required to have representation. All right, so we will jump back in unless anybody has any strong objections. We'll try and knock through a few more contracts tonight, just so we can brush up on that big one. And then with the last 5 to 7 minutes, I will just go through the exam breakdown and my test taking tips, because as I said, I know there are a few of us on the call tonight who are going to be taking that exam in the next 7 days. Some of us will be taking that exam tomorrow, and we are stoked for you, and everyone's going to send you good vibes. All right. Listing agent Jill notifies a client that she is bringing an offer to consider from an MLS agent. On the way to the client's house, Jill receives a call from a buyer with whom she has an agency relationship. The buyer wants to see the listing, and she agrees to meet him at the house. Potential buyer makes an offer, and Jill suggests a price that would be a good offer. Jill looks at the offer sent by the other MLS agent, suggests the buyer offer $500 more. Which statement is true? The listing agent has nothing to worry about. B, the broker should be proud. C, the listing agent did the right thing. Or D, when acting as a dual agent, the salesperson cannot suggest or recommend specific terms. You guys are all over that. Cannot recommend or suggest specific terms, because that, if you are acting as a dual agent, you have the duties of accountability, care, obedience, loyalty, and disclosure to both parties, but they are limited, right? You can't constantly be disclosing everything to both parties, so there are limitations to that. All right, what is the best explanation of an option? A, a document involved in the closing of a real estate transaction. B, legal procedure or action brought by either party, the buyer and seller, to enforce terms of a contract. C, an agreement with consideration granting exclusive rights to buy or lease property at a given price within a stated period of time. Or D, a clause that grants either party the right to cancel the contract provided legal notice. So this is, this is a pretty heavy worded question. So an option is where one party has the option to buy or lease at a given time, at a given price, and there's only one party involved. So an option is a unilateral contract, and it is going to be, sorry. Oh, I don't know why I can't click that. Where one party has preset terms that they can accept at a certain time. So lease with an option to buy or lease with an option for extension are two examples that you may encounter. Right, the first instrument a buyer usually signs in a real estate transaction is A, the offer to purchase, B, the deed, C, the mortgage, or D, the listing agreement. All right, A's all over the chat. It's going to be one of the first things you sign, first instrument that you sign. Listing agreements are between sellers, mortgages on down the line, and then deed signed as well at the end of the transaction. A buyer makes an offer subject to reviewing the results of a home inspection. After the inspection, the buyer is ready to move forward. Which does the buyer's agent need to do at this point? A, prepare an addendum removing the contingency. B, advise the buyer to negotiate the purchase price, renegotiate rather. C, require that the sellers make recommended repairs. Or D, recommend that the buyer get an appraisal of the property. So A, B, and C are all things that could happen, but since the buyer's ready to move forward, you're just going to prepare an addendum and remove the contingency. Now, if there were some things that they wanted fixed, you could prepare an addendum, a removal of contingencies that required certain repairs or required a price change. All of those are very normal things that you will encounter. However, the preparing of the addendum to remove the contingency is the only thing that we're going to do here because the buyer's ready to move forward. The term specific performance refers to A, the legal procedure or action brought by either the buyer or seller to enforce the terms of the contract. B, the right of either party to cancel the contract given legal notice. C, the agreement of all parties of the contract. Or D, an executed contract in which all elements of the contract have been specifically fulfilled. All right, seeing a lot of A's in there. That is going to be correct. Specific performance is what requires one party to specifically perform. This is most often invoked, and I think the example you may see on the exam or you'll see in practice is at the end of a land installment contract, the property is supposed to, the deed is supposed to change hands for, and you know the seller has to sign it over, and if they refuse to do so, you would sue for specific performance. Which has occurred when a contract has been rescinded and each party returns the other any consideration that has been tendered. This is A, restoration, B, restitution, C, replacement, or D, reconciliation. All right, seeing a few A's and a lot of B's in the chat, and that is B is going to be correct. Restoration is when something is restored back to its original condition. You know, hey, this was a marble countertop, and you know this marble came from Italy. Replacement is where it is replaced with an equally functionary thing, like, oh, there was a fireplace here, there's now a different fireplace here, it's not the same fireplace, we replaced it. And then reconciliation is at the end of the appraisal process, reconciling all the information to get to a single number. Question number 7, if the buyer in contract for deed, a land contract, has paid less than 20% of the purchase price and they default, the seller may A, initiate foreclosure proceedings, B, file a lien judgment, C, initiate forfeiture proceedings, or D, wait 10 days and then sell the property to somebody else. All right, the C's are in the chat box, and that's correct. Land contracts that are in place for less than 5 years or less than 20% paid by the buyer, those would be eligible for forfeiture, where that buyer is forfeiting their claim on the property. In order to have a valid contract, the good faith deposit must be paid in the form of A, cashier's check drawn at the buyer's bank, B, anything that the parties agree on, C, a personal check drawn at the seller's bank, or D, cash money in small bills. You can probably guess it's not D by my chuckle, and the answer is B, anything the parties agree on. Earnest money could be, any amount, can be in any form. It can be deposited in any way, shape, or form. There is no standard around earnest money. There are commonalities. It's usually 1 to 2% of the purchase price of the property. It's usually held by the title company. However, if the buyer and seller agree that they want $10,000 on earnest money and they want it in an interest-bearing account and all this other stuff, like, they can do that. It just has to be in the contract. So with earnest money, you do what the contract says. All right. The only thing you can't do is have it be in your name. Once parties have signed a purchase and sale agreement, the buyer's earnest money check is deposited in the broker's special trust account. Whose money is it? A, the buyer's, B, nobody's, C, the broker's, or D, the seller's. You were listening earlier, you likely caught that it is nobody's money at that time. Which are liquidated damages? A, paper money that has been soaked for 24 hours. B, a cashier's check used to empty the broker's trust account. C, an amount parties agree on to settle a potential dispute. Or D, losses suffered when liquidating a business. C is the correct answer. It's the amount the parties pay to settle a potential dispute. Let's get a couple more in here. A condition or contingency in a contract can be waived by the A, party benefiting from the condition or contingency, B, the broker for the seller, C, the broker for the buyer, or D, the lender's appraiser. All right, you got that one. It is A, party benefiting from the condition / contingency. A seller and buyer agree on terms of a purchase and sale agreement and are now waiting for closing to occur. Unfortunately, before closing occurs, the improvements on the property have been struck by lightning and totally destroyed. The buyer can A, terminate the contract, B, accept it as it is, C, any of these answers, or D, accept the property and claim the insurance proceeds. And the answer is C, all of these. They can say, you know what, I'm out. They can be like, you know what, I didn't like that barn anyway. Or they can say, you know what, I'm going to take this, but I want the insurance. All right, last one for tonight. A purchase and sale agreement stipulates the earnest money deposit be placed in a special interest-bearing account with any interest split equally between the buyer and seller. This is A, against the law, B, okay, because the buyer and seller have agreed to it, C, not okay, and the broker should resign the listing, D, money laundering. As we just said, if the buyer and seller agree to it, it is okay. What the hell? Let's just finish this out. If the landlord and the area real estate manager of a national retailer both execute a lease and the corporation fails to occupy the premise, what might prevent the landlord from enforcing the terms of the contract? A, the economy declined and the retailer was closing stores. B, the real estate manager had authority to make the deal. C, the broker did not have a written listing, or D, no corporate resolution granting signing authority to the real estate manager was approved. The answer is D, and this is an important one to remember, especially when working with investors or people representing investment groups. There'll be LLCs, which are corporations. You want to make sure that the person that you are dealing with has the authority to make the deal. I spent 6 months with a client. And when we get to the point of purchasing the property, he said, oh, I have to talk to our chief financial officer, who then nixed the deal altogether. So that was a wonderful use of my time. So learn from my mistakes, folks. All right, if upon receipt of a purchase under certain terms, the seller makes a counteroffer, the prospective purchaser is A, relieved from the original offer, B, bound by the agent's decision, C, bound by the original offer, or D, bound to accept the counteroffer. Remember what we said, when a counteroffer comes in, it is a rejection and therefore termination of the original offer, which relieves the offerer from the original offer. Good job, guys. All right, a few things that I want to cover here while we're all together is, as always, I want to make sure that you guys have the exam breakdown so that you know what questions are on the exam for what sections. So this first section is going to be the national exam, and you have to get 56 of 80 questions right. And the second section is going to be the state exam, where you are required to get 28 of 40 questions right. So as you can see, spending time on contracts is good. Practice of real estate, general principles of agency, as you hear me say every week. 35 of your 80 questions come from those three sections. Valuation is 6. Property ownership is 6, and so on down the line. Financing is 8. So, just don't over-index time into leasing and property management. And then the other thing that we'll talk about, because I know we have so many folks that are gearing up for the exam here in the coming days or coming week, is talking through, okay, how do I prepare myself, or what are the test taking tips? And the number one thing is you have about 120 questions and you got a little over 3 hours to do it. So the important thing is to make sure that you're using the time where you need it, right? You do not have to get every question right. So if you don't know a question, skip it. You might not know this before you sit down in front of the computer to take the exam, but you do not have to answer all the questions in order, right? So the time that I took the exam, the very first question that I opened up looked like it was written in a different language. I had no idea what the question was asking. And so, the first thing you do is panic. and then you realize, wait, I can skip it. So I skipped that question. And the second question wasn't really any better. And I was like, this could be a bad day. So I skip again. And then, I got some layup question around fiduciary duty. And then I got some, and then the next question I knew, and the next question I knew. And so I got rolling, right? And so within the first 90 minutes that I was there, I had answered about 75 questions I read the question. If I didn't know it, skip it. Go on to the next one. If I knew it, I'd go, right? And so I got through about 75 of the 120 questions in the first hour and a half. So now I got an hour and a half to focus on 50 questions, 45 questions. So now I can really put the time in, and guess what happened? Seeing the questions that I knew jogged my memory about the questions that I didn't. So then I just did the same process again. Then, you get back to a question, you're like, oh yeah, that's so obvious. Now that I remembered what accountability, care, obedience, loyalty, and disclosure were, I can now answer this other question. So you run that cycle again, until you have questions that you just don't know. What that has allowed you to do is use your time to get the questions that you know right, and get the questions that you know right? Then have 10 questions, 12 questions where you're just going to have to guess. Then you go through the exercise of eliminating the answers that you know are wrong, right? If you see something about earnest money and it says that, you can't do it because it's against the law, it's likely that that's wrong, unless the question is saying that the seller wants to put the buyer wants to put the check in your name, right? And then okay, so now if I can eliminate one answer, I've just given myself, I went from a 25 to a 33% chance of getting it right. If I can eliminate 2 answers on every question, I double my likelihood of guessing and getting the right answer. And so then you take all the ones that you don't know, and you're never going to know if you sat there all day, and you guess. But you guess after you eliminate the wrong answers. And that's it. I mean, that's if you've spent your time on contracts, you've spent your time on the big money makers, and then when you get in front of that computer, you spend your time answering the questions because if you try and work it straight through, you'll end up stuck on that first question for 5, maybe 10 minutes, right? And then let's say the last 10 questions of the exam, you know outright, but you can never get to them because you run out of time. And if you are, if you finish the exam and you get 3 hours and 15 minutes, I think, if you finish the exam in 3 hours, go back and check your work. There are no bonus points for finishing quickly. So use the time that is allotted, because you can either use 15 more minutes to feel really confident and maybe catch a couple mistakes that you made, right? Or you can use another 3 hours and 15 minutes to retake the exam, right? So don't rush out of there. Give yourself all the time. Now, if you are sitting there and you're 2 hours and 15 minutes and you're all done, check your work a couple times, and you might be able to get out of there 20, 30 minutes early. Don't sit there and second guess yourself, but make sure that you have worked through the exam in the way that I described, checked your work, and you feel confident, right? Don't let your test anxiety creep up and force you to rush through just to get out of there and hope for the best. You guys do great in here. You get the concepts, you know what we're going for, you're going to do well. Give yourself the time and focus on getting all the ones right first. And then there might be 90 of the 120 questions that you feel really confident about. Well, that's awesome, right? And just know that there's no shame in not passing on your first time. You see the stats where it's like, oh my gosh, the average people pass, takes them 3 tries to pass. That's because we see a lot of people who, they get test anxiety and they never want to schedule it. And then they apply and they never want to schedule it. And then get to the point where they have to take it in the next 10 days and they cross their fingers and hope they do well, right? But you guys show up to study sessions, you work hard, you study on your own. You know, you're not going to be the exceptions, or you're going to be exceptions to the rule. And just know that nobody else has to know if you don't pass other than me. You do the paperwork again. You have to pay another $81 to sit for the exam again. But it means nothing to your real estate career. It means nothing to, it's not going to mean anything to your clients. No one's ever going to ask if you passed your exam on the first try. And when you pass, if you pass by a point or 2 points or 10 points, everybody tells everybody that they scored in the 90s. So, don't worry about trying to get a perfect score for that reason, because there's no way to look it up. To answer a couple of questions in here, Tiana, if you don't pass the exam, yes, you do. You don't have to do a background check again. There's a separate retake application. You knock that out, send the $81 down. We do it over, we do it the same way we did it the first time, but you don't have to resend the certificates. You don't have to redo your background check. None of that stuff is an issue. There is not a separate portion for state and national. That's just all 120 questions mixed together. It's not like you get to here's the contract section. But, over the course, you're going to see, more than 10% of all the questions are going to come around contracts. Is each section scored individually? You need to get 56 and 28, right? State and national. That's the only split. I think they show you what you got right and wrong at the end. So in the event that you don't pass, you'll be able to say like, oh, wow, I didn't get any of the general principles of agency. And then you go back to that, and that's where you work to prep yourself, right? The key is to get right back on the saddle, and get back into the exam room as quickly as possible while it's all fresh in your mind.